Precision, often oriented along cardinal directions north, south, east, west. They use standardized mud bricks, often fired in kilns, which makes them much more durable.
Okay.
And the houses followed a general pattern, typically centered around a courtyard that you'd access from the front door, with rooms for different functions, kitchens, work areas, bedrooms arranged around it. The courtyard seems to have been the real heart of family life, much like we see implied in house layouts in, say, Rome or Egypt or Greece centuries or even millennia later.
But the real standout feature, the thing the sources really emphasize, is their infrastructure, right?
That's where it gets truly mind-blowing. This is where we get to those revolutionary innovations.
Like the flush toilets.
Exactly. Many homes in these cities had private bathrooms with
Yes.
flush toilets. Think about that integrated indoor plumbing thousands of years ago. They had complex systems of clay pipes running under the streets, connected to these sophisticated main sewer lines that carried waste away from the city centers.
That's incredible.
It is. And the sources explicitly note that these sewer and drainage systems were actually more advanced than those found in Rome at its absolute peak.
Wow. And Rome's peak was millennia after the Harappan civilization had declined.
Millennia later. They also had features like those wind catchers on roofs, possibly adapted from Persian designs, designed to channel cooling breezes down into the houses, a really early form of climate control or air conditioning.
Flush toilets, sophisticated sewage systems, possibly air conditioning. Thousands of years before these things became common anywhere else. It just completely flips the script on the standard story of technological progress in the ancient world.
It's a truly paradigm-shifting insight, and it comes directly from the archaeological evidence laid out in the sources. It really highlights a different path of technological development, a different set of societal priorities maybe, focused on public health and urban comfort that was just unparalleled at that time. And the two most famous cities that embody this are Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, both located in modern-day Pakistan.
Now, Harappa gives the civilization its name, Harappan civilization, but it's maybe less well-preserved today. Is that right?
That's unfortunately true. We talk about early, middle, and mature Harappan periods. Harappa itself dates back to the middle period, around 3000 BCE. But sadly, in the 19th century, British engineers who were building railways nearby discovered that the ancient city's fired bricks made excellent ballast for the tracks.
Oh, no.
Yeah. So vast quantities of the site were dismantled and just used for railway construction. Plus, local villagers had apparently been taking materials for their own buildings for generations before that. So while we know it was a major Bronze Age city, maybe housing up to 30,000 people.
30,000 people.
Yeah, a significant population. But because of all that destruction, its full historical significance is just much harder to reconstruct compared to Mohenjo-Daro. It's a real tragedy for history.
A terrible loss. So what about Mohenjo-Daro then?
Mohenjo-Daro dates a bit later, to the mature period, around 2600 BCE. And it's much better preserved, largely because it remained mostly buried until its discovery in 1922. Its modern name actually means Mound of the Dead in the Sindhi language. That was a name given by local people based on human remains found there. We don't know its original name, although the sources mention some speculation it might have been a Dravidian name like Kukutarma, which translates to something like City of the Cock.
The City of the Cock. That's memorable. Maybe related to cockfighting.
Possibly. Maybe cockfighting or breeding was important there. Who knows? It's just speculation based on linguistic analysis.
So what does Mohenjo-Daro show us about Harappan life? What have we learned from the better preserved site?
Well, it really confirms that advanced urban planning we talked about. Wide streets laid out in a grid pattern, meeting at right angles, that incredible drainage system again, private wells for water, bathing areas inside houses, and a truly iconic feature there is the Great Bath.
The Great Bath.
Yeah, it's this large, centrally located, beautifully constructed pool. It was possibly heated, suggesting it was a really significant public or communal space, maybe used for ritual purification or just community gatherings, a focal point for the city.
So planned cities, amazing public works, private bathrooms. What about their economy and culture beyond just the buildings?
Their economy seems to have been pretty sophisticated too. They were highly skilled metallurgists working with copper, bronze, lead, and tin. We see evidence of this in artifacts like tools, weapons, but also exquisite artwork. There's the famous dancing girl bronze statue, which is tiny but incredibly detailed, and they made intricately carved seals, often depicting animals which were likely used in trade, perhaps to mark ownership or goods.
Seals for trade.
Okay. Agriculture was obviously a backbone. They cultivated barley, wheat, peas, sesame, and cotton. The sources actually indicate cotton cultivation in India goes way back, maybe as far as 5500 BCE.
Wow, cotton that early. And were they trading with other big civilizations of the time, like Mesopotamia?
Oh, absolutely. The sources confirm really extensive trade networks. There's clear evidence their commerce reached Mesopotamia and possibly even Egypt. Mesopotamian texts from the period actually seem to refer to trading partners that scholars think might be identifiable with the Indus Valley region, maybe calling them Magan and Meluha.
Oh, interesting. So they show up in other people's records.
Exactly. And even more concretely, archaeological digs in Mesopotamia have unearthed actual artifacts, seals, beads, pottery that definitely originated in the Indus Valley region. That's hard proof of this ancient international trade going on.
Okay, so thriving trade. What can we figure out about their religious beliefs from the stuff they left behind?
Well, based on the artifacts, it looks like they engaged in polytheistic worship belief in many gods and various kinds of rituals. Excavations have turned up lots of figures that scholars interpret as representations of deities. Some might even be early forms of gods that later appear in the Vedic Hindu pantheon, like maybe Indra. But really importantly, terracotta figurines depicting what seems to be a mother goddess figure, representing the feminine principle, often called Shakti, are incredibly common finds. This suggests a really widespread popular worship focused on this aspect of the divine.
So a highly organized, technologically advanced urban society, extensive trade, complex religious practices, maybe with a strong emphasis on the feminine divine. Sounds like a very successful, very impressive civilization.
A truly impressive civilization by any measure, which of course leads us directly to one of the biggest, most debated questions about ancient India.
Yeah.
The mystery of the Harappan decline.
Right. What happened? What brought this remarkable culture to an end? And how does it connect or not connect to the arrival of those Aryan groups?
That's the million-dollar question, really. The timing is suggestive, definitely. The Harappan decline seems to accelerate around 1900 BCE, which roughly coincides with the period when these groups identified as Aryans are thought to have begun migrating into the subcontinent, between about 2000 and 1500 BCE. However, and this is crucial, the sources really emphasize that the whole Aryan arrival is now seen much more as a slow migration and assimilation process rather than some sudden violent invasion that destroyed the Harappan cities. And the reasons for the Harappan decline itself are seen as really complex and still debated among scholars. It probably wasn't just one single cause.
Yeah.
But more likely multiple factors all interacting.
Okay, so not a simple invasion story. What are the leading theories then, particularly the environmental ones the sources mentioned?
On climate change is a major contender. There's significant evidence suggesting the region experienced major shifts in weather patterns around that time. This could have included periods of intense drought, which would have been devastating for agriculture.
Crippling for a large population.
Absolutely. And conversely, there's also evidence of increased flooding. The behavior of the Indus River itself seems to be implicated. The sources mention archaeological findings right at Mohenjo-Daro, showing these thick layers of silt up to 30 feet thick in places.
30 feet of silt?
Yeah, suggesting massive, repeated flooding events that would have just devastated the city, destroyed crops year after year, and likely caused widespread famine.
Wow. What about the monsoons?
That's another related possibility. Harappan agriculture was heavily reliant on the annual monsoon rains. If the path of the monsoon gradually shifted, and climate patterns do shift over long periods, it could have rendered large areas that were once fertile unusable, forcing populations to migrate south or east towards areas where the monsoon pattern remained more stable.
So it sounds like environmental collapse, or at least severe environmental stress, played a really significant role. Were there economic factors possibly involved too?
Yes, the sources suggest that disruptions to their vital trade networks could also have been a major contributing factor to the decline. The Harappans, as we said, relied heavily on trade, particularly with Mesopotamia and Egypt. And during the period of the Harappan decline, both of those regions were experiencing their own internal conflicts and instability. So the loss of these key trading partners would have severely impacted the Harappan economy, which was really built on that extensive commerce. Imagine losing your biggest customers, basically.
Yeah, that could definitely contribute to a collapse. So it sounds like the current thinking is a complex interplay of things: environmental disasters, maybe climate change, river changes, combined with economic strain from disrupted trade.
That's the dominant scholarly view presented in the sources now, yes. It's seen more as a systemic collapse, likely triggered or exacerbated by major logical changes and economic disruption, which led to the gradual abandonment of those great cities and a significant shift in population patterns across the region. Not a sudden, violent end, but a slower unraveling.
And it's really worth noting, the sources explicitly dismiss some of those older or more fringe theories about the decline, don't they?
They do, and that's an important point to make clear based on the material. For a while, particularly influenced by certain racialist interpretations in the early 20th century, this idea of a violent Aryan invasion horde sweeping in, conquering and destroying the Harappan civilization was quite popular.
Right, the old invasion hypothesis.
Exactly. But that theory has been pretty thoroughly debunked by modern archaeology, linguistics, and genetic studies. The evidence just doesn't support a massive, destructive invasion. The sources also dismiss the more sensationalist and, frankly, unscientific explanations, things like the decline being caused by extraterrestrials or ancient atomic bombs.
Ah, yes, the ancient aliens theories. What about the vitrification sometimes mentioned, that melted rock?
Right, the vitrification, where you find brick and stone that seems to have been melted and fused together, as if exposed to incredibly intense heat. While it's an intriguing phenomenon found at Mohenjo-Daro and a few other sites, theories attributing this to ancient atomic blasts, sometimes linked to those alien visitation ideas, are just not supported by any credible evidence. The sources point out that similar vitrification has been found at historical warfare sites in other parts of the world, like Trapperian Law in Scotland, and it's generally attributed to the intense heat generated by massive fires, often associated with sacking and burning during conflict, rather than anything nuclear or extraterrestrial. Okay, so we stick to the evidence-based explanations. Climate, rivers behaving badly, trade networks falling apart, and as the Harappan culture declined and population shifted and maybe mingled with newcomers, the Vedic period begins to take shape. That's the transition, yes. The Vedic period spans roughly from 1500 down to about 500 BCE. And this period is characterized less by those huge, planned urban centers of the Harappans and more by a predominantly pastoral lifestyle, centered around the religious and philosophical traditions that were being codified in the Vedas, those foundational texts we mentioned earlier, which themselves seem to have grown out of that blending of indigenous and incoming Aryan cultures.
And this is the period where the Varna system, what we often call the caste system, really solidifies.
It is, yes. Vedic society developed a very distinct social structure, divided into four main classes, or varnas. You had the Brahmana, who were typically the priests, the scholars, the keepers of ritual knowledge. Then the Kshatriya, the warriors, rulers, administrators. Below them, the Vaishya, who were the farmers, merchants, artisans, this sort of economic engine. And finally, the Shudra, who were laborers, servants, performing essential services.
And there was also a group outside this four-part system.
Yes. The sources also mention the existence of a group, often referred to historically as Dalits, or untouchables, who were tasked with occupations considered ritually impure. However, the exact nature and the rigidity of this distinction in the very earliest Vedic antiquity is something scholars still debate. It likely evolved and hardened over time.
So was this Varna system always as rigid and birth-determined as it became known much later in history?
Probably not initially. The sources suggest that in the earlier Vedic period, the Varna system seems to have been perhaps more based on a person's aptitude, occupation, and skills, maybe allowing for some degree of mobility between the groups. But over centuries, yes, it definitely evolved into a much more rigid hierarchy. One's Varna became strictly determined by birth, with very limited possibilities for moving between classes or for intermarriage between them.
And this social structure, this hierarchy, was tied directly into their whole worldview, their religious beliefs.
Oh, absolutely. Fundamentally tied. The sources explain that this evolving social hierarchy wasn't just a social arrangement. It was seen as a reflection of a larger cosmic divine order, a belief in an eternal order governing not just human life but the entire universe, often associated with a supreme underlying divine reality. The social order was believed to be part of this larger, stable, cosmic structure. If the cosmos had an order, society should reflect it.
So this period really solidifies both the social order and the religious framework that would eventually become known as Hinduism.
Exactly. The religious beliefs and practices, which certainly existed in various forms much earlier, became systematized during the Vedic period into what adherents themselves often call Sanatana Dharma.
Sanatana Dharma, that means eternal order or eternal path, right?
That's right. The term Hinduism is actually a later term, geographically derived. It comes from the name of the Indus River Sindhu in Sanskrit, which the Persians and Greeks pronounced as Hindus, referring to the people living across or beyond the Indus. So Hinduism is sort of an external label initially, while Sanatana Dharma refers to the ancient internal understanding of the tradition as this eternal way or order.
Okay, so what's the core idea of Sanatana Dharma, this eternal order?
As the sources describe it, the really fundamental tenet is this belief that there's an inherent universal order, a kind of cosmic law or purpose called dharma, that underlies all existence and all human life. The idea is that when individuals live in accordance with this order, following their own specific path and duties within that structure, they experience life in its proper harmonious state, aligned with the flow of the universe.
And the divine aspect, because looking from the outside, it often seems very polytheistic, with this huge pantheon of gods and goddesses.
It certainly appears that way, and the devotional practices often focus on specific deities. But the sources clarify that while there are countless deities in divine forms, Sanatana Dharma, at its philosophical core, is often understood as monotheistic, or perhaps more accurately, monistic or pantheistic in its understanding of ultimate reality. How so? There's a belief in one supreme, all-encompassing, ultimate divine entity known as Brahman. Brahman is understood in incredibly diverse ways, sometimes as the ultimate self within all beings, sometimes as the universe itself, the source, the